Hello everyone. Today's session is all about the apoptosis, the programmed form of cell death. We shall be discussing various aspects that are related to the apoptosis mechanism. In today's session, let us cover basic introduction to the cell death and need for the cell death in the body. What are the various mechanisms by which the cell die, and also apoptosis, that is called as the programmed pathway, and mechanism of apoptosis, that is the subcategories of apoptosis, and pathways in the apoptosis. At the end, we shall discuss about the significance of apoptosis. When we look at the word cell death, basically it means death of something in the body. This is a common phenomenon that is happening both in case of plants as well as in the animals. So cells have to die. So the cell in the body have to die for various reasons. The death of the cells might be due to the natural process of aging. Also, that might be due to the infections that are caused on it due to certain radiations, exposure to harmful chemicals, and also infection of various organisms to the cell. So ultimately, the cell death has to happen in the body to remove the unwanted cells from the body. If the body fails to remove the unwanted cells from it, ultimately it leads to abnormalities in the body that can be called as a cancer. Cell death in the body is a most common phenomenon, and there are various reasons for it. One of the reasons being the stress, and other reason being the involvement of reactive oxygen species with the cells, ultimately causing them to die. Whatsoever the reason might be, the death of the cell in the body is a mandatory process even in order to keep the number of cells in the body in check. It is estimated that approximately 50 to 18 million cells die per day. Body eliminates cells in order to supply it to the various other regions. Like if we want to cover the body by the external surface, we require dead cells. So for that, the body has to supply it from one or the other source. So one strong reason for the cell death in the body is to supply the dead cells to the various other organs of the body. Also, during the embryonic stages of development, these cell death plays very important role both for the formation of organs in the body and organelles in the body. Say for example, let us consider the example of the hand. Whatsoever the hand we have today is not webbed feet, unlike the birds and other creatures have. This webbed feet, the absence of webbed feet in the human being is basically due to the cell death that has occurred in this particular part of the body, which has made us to have fingers in order to hold the substances intact. Also, due to various infections that happen in the body, the infected cell cannot, when the infected cells cannot be repaired or replaced, they'll have to be killed or they'll have to be terminated from the function. So even the cell death is very important in order to terminate the infected cells in the body. And the cells sometimes might be exposed to harmful chemicals, harmful radiations, and other sort of chemical substances. So the cells infested with these substances have to be eliminated because the functional capacity of those infected cells are completely lost. And ultimately, when the body encounters with a virus or a bacterium that can manipulate by taking the control of the genetic material of the cell, even that particular point of time, the cell has to be terminated in order to retain the other cells of the same community. Cell death in the body happens in various mechanisms. Few of the mechanisms have a programmed pathway or a channel, and other mechanisms might not have those programs, and the cell death might be abrupt. Whatsoever the program might be, at the end the cell death is something that is ultimate. So there are 4 different ways in which the cell ends its life. All the 4 different steps are apoptosis, necrosis, necroptosis, and pyroptosis. Apoptosis is a form of programmed cell death where step-by-step sequential process happen in order to kill the cell in a systematic way. The apoptotic pathway activates caspase, a separate group of proteins which break the cell into smaller fragments, and they make the phagocytic cells to engulf it. So this is a most systematic way of cell death that is occurring in the body. Termination of old cells in the body, or the replacement of old cells in the body, and also by the programmed way replacement of something in the body happens through this particular pathway of apoptosis. Necrosis is a second way in which the cell ends its life. This is not something that is happening in a normal pathway. Instead, that is something that is happening in an abnormal pathway. So whenever the cell comes in contact with the chemical substances or the harmful radiation, that triggers the sudden burst of the cytoplasm of it, so which leads to the leakage of the intercellular components to the extracellular matrix, and the necrosis process even develops inflammation through the to the neighboring cells that are existing right next to it. So necrosis is not a systematic process, rather it is a non-systematic process where the inflammatory activity in the body is triggered. Pyroptosis is another form of cell death that usually happens in the cells which are infested by virus or bacteria. This can be said as a modified form of necrosis. The main difference that exists between necrosis and pyroptosis is the inflammatory response that is produced. In the necrosis, inflammation is spread to the neighboring cells, whereas in pyroptosis, the inflammatory response or the inflammatory message is supplied well in advance. In pyroptosis, the cell which is infected or which is undergoing the death informs the neighboring cells to be very cautious about the infection. So, the spreading of infections across the members of the same cellular family is not possible. So, this checks the spread of disease in the body. Necroptosis is another form of cell death which can be said as modified version of apoptosis, where the death of the cell is initiated by a group of proteins. The cells which are infested by virus, bacteria, or whatsoever the pathogen might be, they are infested by a group of proteins that ultimately kill the cell and prevent the body from being infected. Apoptosis is a form of programmed cell death that happens mainly due to the action of certain enzymes. The enzymes in the body, they actually degrade the nuclear and the cytoplasmic material of the cell. When the degradation happens, the cell is ultimately broken down into smaller fragments called as apoptotic bodies, and these bodies are well gobbled by the phagocytic cells. Apoptosis is a biological mechanism that is happening both in plants as well as in the animals. Apoptosis is very essential in order to remove the dead cells or waste cells or the old cells from the body. So it is most systematic way in which the replacement of the cell in the body happens. Also, the apoptosis cell helps in checking or keeping the immune system of the body intact. So whenever there is any inflammatory response, when there is exceeding in the number of WBC cells, so those WBC cells which are active, they have to be terminated, and all those termination happens through the systematic process called as apoptosis. Apoptosis in the body is mainly triggered when the body has been infested by virus or bacteria, or when there is any misleading in the protein folding that might happen at the transcription or the translational level, and mainly due to the DNA damage that is happening when the body is being exposed to harmful chemicals or radiations or even the reactive oxygen species. So by all these factors, all these three factors, the apoptotic pathway in the body is triggered. Apoptotic mechanism include step-by-step degradation of a normal cell or a aged cell into a smaller fragment called as apoptotic body, which can freely be engulfed by the phagocytic cells that are available in the system. Once the cell receives the termination signal, there initiates the process of shrinking of the cell, where the cytoplasmic content and other cellular contents start to shrink. The shrinking of the cell reduces the cell volume, and the cytoplasmic organelles and the cytoplasm is now packed tightly. Once the cell is completely shrunk, next initiates a process called as pycnosis, where the condensation of the genetic material, that is a nuclear chromatin, happens. The condensation of the nuclear chromatin might be directed towards the center of the cell, or it might even be directed towards the periphery of the cell. So at the end of the pycnosis process, both the cell organelles, that is cytoplasmic content, and the nuclear content of the cell are condensed completely. The moment pycnosis completes, next initiates is a process called as karyorrhexis, or the degradation of the cell membrane of the cell. The degradation or the karyorrhexis mechanism has to happen compulsorily, because the cell membrane or the cell wall has to be distributed to the each fragment that is present in the cytoplasm. Karyorrhexis is a valuable step in the entire apoptotic mechanism because the distribution of the cell wall happens to each and every organelle that is present within it. By the end of the karyorrhexis initiates bleb formation, that is the crust and trough formation. This is a step where the breaking down of the cell membrane of the cell takes place, and the broken down cell membrane is equally distributed to all cell organelles which are situated within it. Bleb is ultimately broken down into smaller fragments or smaller pieces called as apoptotic bodies. These apoptotic bodies are well covered by the cell membrane and they have got cellular content within them. These have got the signaling mechanism which is sensed by the phagocytic cell in the body, which come and engulf at the end of apoptotic mechanism. So this is a step-by-step sequence where a normal cell is completely degraded into apoptotic bodies which can ultimately be engulfed by the phagocytic cells through the process of phagocytosis. Unlike necrosis, apoptosis do not elicit any inflammatory response in the body. This is due to the placement of the cell membrane around each cell organelle that was present in the cytoplasm of the cell. The apoptotic bodies that are produced at the end of apoptosis are well protected with a cell membrane which are not recognized by the defense system of the body and which in turn do not lead to any inflammatory response in the body. This is a major difference that exists between necrosis and apoptosis. The apoptotic bodies are very quickly identified by the phagocytic cells which approach them and engulf them completely by the process of phagocytosis, which terminates or kills the cell. So by the process of apoptosis, body maintains constant number of cells, that is number of cells died per day, which would almost be equal to number of cells that are synthesized per day. So this is called as cellular homeostasis that is maintained by the process of apoptosis. Depending upon the signal that is received to the cell, the apoptosis has three different pathways, or the process of apoptosis is categorized into three different mechanisms. One of them being intrinsic pathway, other one being the extrinsic pathway, and third one being the enzyme mediated pathway, or it is also called as Perforin mediated pathway. The first pathway of apoptosis, that is intrinsic pathway, is followed by the cell when the cell is damaged internally, or the internal environment of the cell is damaged. In general, the cytoplasm of the cell contains a group of proteins that are non-apoptotic or anti-apoptotic in function, that are BCL2 complex and BCLX complex. These two protein complexes keeps apoptosis in check, or they prevent frequent apoptosis of the cell. When these BCL2 complex and BCLX complex are suppressed, the cell undergoes apoptosis in intrinsic pathway or intrinsic mechanism. Considering a classic example of intrinsic pathway, let us take the example of one of the cell organelle, one of the most important cell organelle in the cytoplasm of the cell, that is the mitochondria. Mitochondria is very essential cell organelle in the body that is responsible for various activities like glycolysis, TCA cycle, beta oxidation of fatty acids. Therefore, keeping mitochondria intact is very, very crucial. When there is any damage that has occurred to the membrane of the mitochondria, that start leaking the proteins from the internal membrane of the mitochondria to the cytoplasm. This leaking of proteins cannot be prevented. Therefore, the cell has to be terminated, or the cell has to be induced into the death phase. Or when mitochondria undergoes certain stress, like the stress from radiation, or the stress due to protein misfolding, or even due to some of the mutation that might happen during the protein folding, even at that point of time, the cell induces apoptosis, or the cell would undergo apoptosis through the intrinsic pathway. When the cell is pushed to intrinsic pathway of apoptosis, blocking of BCL2 and BCLX complex is very, very crucial, and that is carried out by another group of proteins called as BH3 only proteins, which has three domains, that is BIM, BID and BAD. These three domains block the activity of BCL2 and BCLX. Blocking of BCL2 and BCLX complex triggers the activation of two apoptotic factor, that is BAX complex and BAK complex, which act on the mitochondria of the cell. The two apoptotic factors BAX and BAK creates channel or creates tunnel for the free flow of proteins from the internal environment of the mitochondria into the cytoplasm of the cell. The entire protein content of the mitochondria in the form of cytochrome C now tends to move from the mitochondrial matrix into the cytoplasm of the cell. The proteins that are coming from the mitochondrial matrix into the cytoplasm now attacks a separate complex that is present in the cytoplasm called as APAF1 complex, that is apoptosis activating factor 1. So the binding of cytochrome C to the apoptotic activating factor 1 enables the formation of something called as apoptosome. Formation of apoptosome initiates the cascade mechanism of caspase complexes. Caspases are special group of proteases which can be abbreviated as cysteine aspartic proteases. So when apoptosome formation triggered the activation of caspase complex, now the complex number 9, or it is also called as activator caspase or initiator caspase, binds to this apoptosomes. So binding of caspase 9 complex to apoptosome activates second category of caspases called as executional or executionary caspases, that is caspase 3 and caspase 6, which ignites the phagocytic cells to attack the cell. The phagocytic cells now attacks the cell that has leaking mitochondria or the damaged mitochondria. Now the cell is completely broken down into small pieces and it is completely engulfed by the phagocytic cells through the process of phagocytosis. So this is one mechanism where when the cell has got injury within it or intrinsic injury of the cell leads to the intrinsic pathway of apoptosis. Other two mechanisms of apoptosis, that is extrinsic pathway and granzyme pathway, follows a common protocol, that is FAS receptor ligand interaction. Various cells in the body have got FAS receptors on it. So these FAS receptors have the capacity to bind to the cytotoxic C lymphocyte cells when there is any damage that has occurred to the cell. In the normal conditions, these FAS receptors do not send any signal to the ligand or do not bind to the FAS ligand. Only when there is any damage that has occurred to these cells, the FAS receptors tend to bind to the FAS ligand that is present on the CD8 T cell or cytotoxic T lymphocyte cell. So the interaction of this FAS ligand and receptor induces apoptosis in the body, and this mechanism is followed by two different pathways, extrinsic pathway and the granzyme pathway of apoptosis. The extrinsic pathway of apoptosis is triggered by an external stimuli, that is a ligand that binds to the CD8T cytochrome cell. This external stimuli that is binding to the CD8T cells initiates the process of the cell death or the apoptosis. So whenever any damage that might have occurred to the cell, so whenever damage has caused extreme effect killing more than 3 to 4 cells, these cells give out a separate signaling complex called FADD, or it is also called as FAS associated death domain. This domain in turn goes and attaches with the ligand that is present on the CD8 T cells, and these CD8 T cells, they initiate the process of apoptosis. Death of more cells at one point of time triggers apoptosis through extrinsic pathway. The cells that are dead due to any external influence, might be due to the virus attack, might be due to the harmful radiations, have now given out a command in a form of FADD, that is FAS associated death domain. This FAS associated death domain has now bound to the FAS ligand that is present on the CD8T cell. CD8T cell now activates another caspase or the proteolytic enzymes, that is caspase number 8, which is once again initiating caspase, that in turn activates another group of terminating or the executionary caspases, that is C3 and C6, caspase 3 and caspase 6, which ultimately produces the apoptotic signal, and now the phagocytic cells come and attack this particular inflamed cells or infected cells. They kill it and they engulf it through the process of phagocytosis. So to brief the extrinsic pathway, whenever any cell has got damage due to the external factors, the cell induces or produces FADD signal, which is very well recognized by CD8T cells, which induce the caspase activity, which in turn leads to the apoptotic way of killing the cell. The last mechanism under apoptosis is perforin mediated apoptosis or granzyme mediated apoptosis. This pathway is much like the extrinsic pathway, where the interaction of FAS ligand and FAS receptor initiate the process of apoptosis. The only difference that exists is with respect to the FADD that is not produced by the perforin. Instead, they secrete another important substance that is taken over by the T cells. The cell that has been damaged or that has now been broken down, which has to be replaced, would be taken over by the T cells that produces two major components or two major factors, one being perforin and second one being granzyme. Perforin is a complex that is capable of creating pores on the cell membrane, and granzyme is a specific protein that is again secreted by the T cells, which is capable of entering through the pore and has the capacity to activate the caspases, that is caspase number 3 and caspase number 6. To summarize the entire perforin or the granzyme pathway, whenever the cell has to be terminated or whenever the cell has to be removed from the body, the T cells takes over those cells, and these T cells, they create or they secrete two major substances, one being perforin, the second one being granzyme. Perforin first attacks the cell and it creates pores on the cell membrane for the passage of granzyme. The granzyme then passes into the cytoplasm of the cell, which in turn activates the caspase 3 and caspase 6, which can also lead to the abnormal DNA cloning, which initiates the process of apoptosis. This is one more pathway where the old cells in the body or the aged cells in the body can be easily eliminated. The name to this pathway is given just because the component perforin and granzyme are secreted by the T cells that are present in the body. As we all know, caspases are a special group of proteolytic enzymes which have the capacity to degrade the cell, are very well employed in apoptotic mechanism. There are two categories of caspases, one being the initiation caspases and second one being the executional caspases. The executional caspases C3 and C6, they have the capacity to degrade the genetic material or the DNA content, and also they have the capacity to degrade the cytoskeletal proteins, which leads to nuclear fragmentation and cell shrinking respectively. So these two caspases C3 and C6 play very important role in creating the fragmentation and also helpful in the shrinking of the cells. And also a point to remember here, these apoptotic bodies or the end point of the apoptosis that creates a tiny fragment called as apoptotic bodies, they are very well coated with a special group of phospholipid called as phosphatidylserine, and this phosphatidylserine is very well recognized by the phagocytic cells, which induce the process of phagocytosis. Also, sometimes the apoptotic bodies can be coated with immunoglobulin G or IgG, which have a separate group of proteins like C3b, which recognize the phagocytic cells, and again easily the phagocytosis can be induced. Looking at various mechanisms of apoptosis, ultimate aim of apoptosis is to eliminate either damaged cell from the body or aged cell from the body or unused cell from the body, which helps the body to maintain the cell number in constant. For suppose if apoptosis do not happen in the body, there is rapid increase in the cell number that might lead to abnormal growth of various organs in the body. Therefore, apoptosis play significant role in all the living creatures. As we discussed in previous slides, apoptosis is even responsible for organ formation that happens at the embryonic stages. Due to the process of apoptosis or due to the process of rapid termination of the cells, there is low risk of cancer. Whenever apoptosis do not happen, there is rapid division or rapid growth of the cells, or even the accumulation of cells at one point of time can induce cancer in the body. Therefore, apoptosis even checks or controls cancer to certain extent. The old cells or the cells that are functionally inactive, which have to be replaced, are replaced by the process of apoptosis that might happen through extrinsic pathway or granzyme mediated pathway. Due to the systematic process that is followed in the apoptosis, the recycling of various components takes place. The essential components like proteins, which are coated with cytoplasm, can be recycled again by the body, and apoptosis tends to kill more and more cells, and the dead cells can be supplied to the regions where they are in need or they are needed, which balances the living cells and non-living cells in the body. By all these factors, apoptosis is said to be one of the most important and one of the most significant processes. So that was all about apoptosis, its importance, significance, and also various mechanisms. Hope you guys have understood. Let us meet again in some other video. Till then, keep smiling. Cheers.